Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce everyone here. My name is Jason Bocarro. I'm a professor at NC State, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this opening panel focused on sports events, governance, and advocacy. Today, we've got four incredibly distinguished panelists. I'm going to very, very quickly introduce them all, but the document that was sent out to you has a more extensive background behind each of these panelists. I encourage you to look through them. So first off, we have Liz Twyford, as well as being the sports program specialist at Unicef. Liz is one of the founders and the coordinator of the International Safeguards for Children in Sport initiative. Secondly, we've got Dr. Andreas Graf, who is FIFA's head of human rights and anti-discrimination, where he coordinates FIFA's work to embed respect for human rights throughout FIFA's operations and relationships. Third, we've got Sylvia Schenk, a lawyer for Herbert Freehills LLP in Frankfurt, who specializes in compliance, human rights, and sports law. Sylvia is also a member of the Legal Council of Athletes Germany and chairs the working group on Sport Transparency International, as well as Interpol's Standing Committee on Ethical Matters. And finally, we've got David McGillivray, my friend and colleague, a professor in the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events at the University of Western Scotland. So what we'll do, we're going to facilitate a panel around a couple of questions, and then we'll have hopefully time for about 10 minutes of questions from the audience. So feel free, as we did with the first panelist, to type some of your questions in the chat in there. So before we start, I'd like to start the panel by asking each of the panelists to provide a little bit of a background behind you and your organization and how your work relates to issues of human rights advocacy in sport. And Liz, we'll start with you and then move to Andreas, Sylvia, and then David.
Thanks, Jason. So hello, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity today. My name is Liz Twyford and I work at Unicef UK. So Unicef UK is part of the global family of Unicef, the world's largest organisation focused on children and their rights. And for about the last 10 years, we've been looking specifically at that intersection between sport and children's rights. And in particular, we focus on children's rights in sport, so children who are playing sport and how their rights are protected, children's rights around sport, and that speaks to the issue of today, so looking at the impact of mega sporting events on children and their rights, and finally, children's rights through sport, so how sport can be a positive platform to support children in realising their rights. We've been doing that for about 10 years. Back in 2012, as you mentioned, we established the International Safeguards for Children in Sport initiative that looks to promote practical steps that sports organisations can take to make sport safer. In 2014, as partner for the Glasgow Commonwealth Games, we were involved in mapping the child rights impacts of that particular event. And since then, as I've mentioned, we've been very involved in looking at identifying issues and offering practical solutions in this space around children's rights and sport. So that's included input to Commonwealth Games and FIFA on their bid criteria, practical technical support around safeguarding to a number of sporting bodies. We've developed an annex to ISO 2012-1, which is the sustainable event standard to integrate human and child rights and safeguarding into the considerations of sustainability around events. We've conducted research called Children Before Players, looking particularly at elite athletes and some of the issues that affect them. And finally, we've been involved in drafting model legislation around positions of trust to make sure that they're inclusive of people within sports designations. So a range of different areas, hard and soft advocacy involved, but I'll hand over to my fellow panelists now.
Andreas.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone. And appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, share some thoughts and background on the work we do at FIFA. So my name is Andreas Graf. I head FIFA's Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination team. I joined FIFA back in 2016, a few months after the organization has integrated the human rights commitment in its statutes. I joined with a background in business and human rights, in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. having worked before with the UN Working Group and the Swiss government around the implementation of the UNGPs, mostly at the state level, and also having done a PhD on the impact of international business and human rights norms on domestic policy. That helps me quite well, understanding how international norms can shape not only what governments do, but also what sports governing bodies do. So pleased to share some of reflections in that respect, also based on what Daniela had shared in her introductory speech. At FIFA, so having joined in 2016, this meant working with a team to develop FIFA's human rights policy, the new requirements that we are introducing for mega sporting events since 2017, being involved very heavily in the strategy work, development and implementation for the World Cups in Russia, Qatar, also the Women's World Cup in France, and a host of other topics that you can imagine land on our desks, from women's access to stadiums in Iran, evacuations in Afghanistan, regulations of gender eligibility, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a wide range that our team, of topics that our team is dealing with, including with respect to mega sporting events, but beyond that as well. And again, pleased to be part of the conference today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Sylvia.
Hello, everybody, and thank you as well from my side for inviting me. There's a close link between governance, anti-corruption on the one side, and the violation of human rights on the other side. Where you don't have the rule of law, it's difficult to protect human rights. And so you can see when governance in the sport organizations and governance around major sport events is not preserved, then you will have, of course, human rights violations, and you cannot protect human rights without anti-corruption and without governance within the sport organizations, but as well within the host countries and host cities. I myself, I have been an Olympic athlete running 800 meters at the Olympic Games in Munich, 1972, so 50 years now. And then I've been working as a volunteer in sport all my life on national and international level, ending up in cycling. And there I was, asking some uncomfortable questions about doping and how we deal with it. And then finally I was kicked out in 2005 and started to work with Transparency International on anti-corruption in sport, establishing the entire work on sport within the movement. Then thanks to FIFA and Mr. Blatter with the corruption scandal in 2010, this topic, sport and anti-corruption, all of a sudden was on the international agenda. Before that, my colleagues at Transparency International had told me, well, interesting topic, but we have much more important topics. So go ahead, but we cannot support you. And then all of a sudden, it was clear with sport, you can bring anti-corruption and what it means for different sectors, not just the sport, but other sectors as well, high on the agenda. And so I started to work on FIFA. I got in touch because with Qatar and the awarding, the human rights issue came onto the table too, with human rights organizations, and together with a colleague from Football Supporters Europe in 2014, we invited to the Office of Transparency Germany several organizations we were working with. So it was Football Supporters Europe, International Trade Union Corporation, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and some more. And that was the start. And Liz, I think we know one another from more or less that time. It was the start of the Sport and Rights Alliance. And now this alliance, where we are partners with some more partners as well, Committee to Protect Journalists and ILGA, International Lesbian and Gay Associations, and some others. This partnership, this alliance works on anti-corruption and human rights in sport. And so, that's what I've been working on as a volunteer, not paid by Transparency International. I'm a lawyer by profession. The last 8 years now, I have been a member of FIFA's advisory board on human rights from 2017 to 2020. And Transparency International just published some weeks ago an international study on sextortion in sport. Sextortion means misuse of power, not to receive money as a bribe, but in the end to receive sexual favors. And that is close to sexual abuse, but is a specific approach to the situation, and it's very important to work on prevention of sextortion and to look into the overall structure of sport organizations internationally and nationally, because misuse of power is everywhere, and whether it leads to sextortion or to corruption regarding money or bad dealing with other rights of athletes, it's all the same, and we have to look onto that and really change the structure within the sport organizations, because without that we cannot implement human rights, and neither in the sport organization in their daily work nor in the events. So that's for the beginning from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. David, would you like to add a few comments?
Yeah, I'll just add some brief comments. So yeah, I guess for the last decade and more, I've been interested in the context of mega sport and events in particular, and a range of social issues associated with those events. And I guess that's focused in on maybe two main areas, mainly kind of ideas about the access to urban space, around about the restrictions on urban space created by the kind of gargantuan projects often, and the effect on the whole city. And also more recently around about issues on disability rights in the context of major parasport events. So that focus has been an interest for the last number of years, and probably in the last 3 or 4 years, been particularly interested in this broader human rights debate, because it just seems to be much more focus upon this, much more progress actually made in the enshrining rights-based agendas within the arrangements for these events, and so that's really been the focus for the last couple of years, partly as a function of our involvement also in the Event Rights Project, which I was heavily involved in writing. So yeah, that's where I'm at this stage, Jason. Thanks.
So this is really exciting. What a great introduction to the panel. And I know Daniela touched upon this first question earlier this morning, but you know, in your view, how effectively have human rights commitments been enshrined in the governance arrangements for major and mega sporting events? And Liz, I'll start with you again.
Thanks, Jason. And in answering this question, I started to think about what does effective mean in practice. And I suppose from my perspective, it's only effective if it leads to change. So it protects people, or it provides better access to remedy. And for me, there are 3 pillars to that in order for change really to happen. One is that the commitments need to be embedded. Yes, absolutely. 2, that the commitments need to be implemented. And 3, that there needs to be some form of enforcement when that breaks down. And I'm going to talk about each of those in turn, because I think we're at different stages of progress with respect to those 3 different pillars. So in terms of the commitments being embedded, as Daniela mentioned, there has been some progress in that regard. So FIFA, IOC and the Commonwealth Games have all made reference to human and child rights and safeguarding to various degrees within now the bid criteria. So I think we're seeing progress. I think there's a way to go, but we are definitely seeing some movement around embedding the commitments. Where we see less progress is around implementation and enforcement. So when I think about implementation, I think there's 2 elements to that. One is implementation in decision making. So to what extent does the decision to award an event take note of human rights considerations? It's one thing to put it in the bid conditions and for bid cities or bid countries to put detailed information about human rights in their bids. It's another thing whether that's in any way a factor in how decisions are made about where events are hosted. So I think there's one bit of implementation on the decision making, and interestingly, I think we're seeing a move away from these competitive bidding more into a kind of dialogue based bidding approach, which I think is probably an indication of the need for greater risk management coming from the awarding bodies. But the second element of implementation is by the host cities and the host countries and the organising committees themselves, in terms of taking the requirement and turning it into something concrete that makes an actual difference for people on the ground. And again, we have seen some progress. So we saw with United 2026 that right at bid stage, there was some stakeholder engagement, and that's continued into some of the elements of the host city selection process. For Birmingham 2022, we've again seen some investigation into human rights impacts. We're seeing some great moves around safeguarding. They've appointed a head of safeguarding, and they're doing some really interesting work around safeguarding at the event. So, you know, great. We welcome that progress, but again, still a way to go in terms of implementation. But the area that I think is weakest, and Daniela touched on this as well, is around enforcement. So who is accountable? Who holds who accountable? How does an awarding body hold a host city accountable once the award has been made and once there is no more leverage left? I think this is a really tricky part, but I also think it's the part where we need most attention, because I think in the accountability mechanisms and the enforcement mechanisms, that's where we really see a dire need for progress.
Thank you so much, Liz. Andreas, from your perspective at FIFA, what thoughts do you have?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm going to speak about FIFA. I cannot really speak about others, but I think it connects quite neatly with Lisa's outline there. So if I think about how FIFA has integrated human rights commitment across the organization of mega sporting events, I think it has happened over the past years at 4 different levels. First level is around the bidding process and the overall requirements. Since November 2017, we've integrated human rights requirement in all of our bidding processes, which has included asking from hosting member associations and the host governments, host cities, and other entities linked to the bid to provide commitments, guarantees, strategies, independent context assessment, all with 3 objectives, right? The first objective is to make sure that from day one, and Daniela has mentioned that before, from day one, human rights are a factor in the planning of a potential future event. That makes sure that the right type of staff is involved in the early planning of the bid, and make sure that stakeholders are being consulted in the early days. So that's quite key. Second objective is for us as the governing body to have enough information at the selection stage to know whether we can be comfortable selecting a particular bid. And really to assess whether are there any red flags with a particular bid that we need to take into consideration that might have to be raised to the decision-making body for them to take that into account in the selection. So that might be a slight difference from my perspective and what at least said before. From my perspective, and I think anchored in the UNGPs, as long as we are comfortable with going to a country based on our own human rights commitments, and we are comfortable that we'll be able to organize the event in line with our own international requirements and commitments. As a head of human rights at FIFA, to me it's secondary whether human rights actually play a role in the deliberations or not. What I want to make sure is that when we raise a red flag, it's actually taken into consideration. And we have done that once when the Iranian Federation bid for the Futsal World Cup a few years ago, when we were not comfortable with the types of commitments we had for women to be able to attend the games in a non-discriminatory manner. So that is the second objective. So to learn about red flags and being able to integrate them in the selection. And then thirdly is to have those commitments, requirements in the contracts themselves, so that when we start working with the selected host, that we have a contractual basis for that collaboration. So that's really the level of the bidding process and overall requirements. Then there's a level of strategy and implementation. We have started to develop quite detailed strategies for our events. They are usually labeled as sustainability strategies covering environmental, economic, and social topics, but include human rights related areas. We have developed such strategies actually already for South Africa and Brazil, but more robustly, I think, from a human rights perspective for Russia, and now in particular for Qatar. And that's the work we're right now doing for Australia and New Zealand, the Women's World Cup next year, and start to do for 2026, the US, Canada, Mexico. So having that as part of the modus operandi in how FIFA organizes tournaments, to have a risk assessment and then define a strategy on how to address the salient issues is I think, quite key in terms of embedding human rights into the governance and arrangements and procedures. Then policies and procedures as a third element. It's not something that is often discussed, and certainly not something you read about in the newspapers, but our team does a lot of work in going through several hundred policies and procedures that inform the organization of a mega sporting event such as the World Cup in Qatar. That ranges from from policies at the airport, from how people are treated at the entrance by security staff, to how a prayer room is being set up and operated, for example, in a stadium. So having human rights people looking at all of those policies from a human rights lens allows us to embed human rights across the organization of the event. And it's quite crucial because this is based on what the different people who are operating in the tournament environment are being based on delivering their activities towards. And then lastly, and that goes to Liz's point before, there's nothing, there's no impact without people doing the work. And I do think we've made quite significant progress as an organization in that respect. If we look at the setup in Qatar, we will have about 25 full-time staff working on human rights related matters, half of them on workers' rights, the other half on other areas. We'll have about 250 volunteers. Human rights volunteers as one category, and then sustainability volunteers doing a lot of the accessibility assistance work as another category. And we have a total of about 250 staff of contractors who support our projects in Qatar during the event time, ranging from anti-discrimination monitoring systems in the stadiums to support services for disabled people, for example, with respect to audio descriptive commentary or sensory rooms. So a wide range of other areas where we work with contractors. So just to sum that up, I think we have robust systems in place, but it requires the work of everyone involved each and every time in a way that meets the needs of the local context. And that is, that's I guess what makes the work of our team quite interesting, knowing that we can have things in the policies and procedures, but it needs to be delivered each and every time. And we'll have our own challenges, we'll fail on some areas and we'll be successful in other areas and learn from them for the future competition.
Thank you, Andreas. It's really interesting to see the perspective from FIFA. Sylvia.
Yeah, just some explanation in advance. There is a window telling me again and again that our firm's firewall doesn't like me to be in this on this link. So IT managed to get me in, but they didn't manage to get this window finally closed. And again it pops up, and then I cannot work on the micro or anything else. So if I sometimes look a bit nervous, please understand I'm just trying to close the window and have you all on the screen again. Yeah, I of course know the work of FIFA best because I've been heavily involved for 4 years and then followed up afterwards, of course, and already started with the awarding in 2010. I want to stress some points. First of all, it's a journey. And the journey has just begun. Even if we think about 2014 or maybe even 1-2 years earlier, for change management on a global scale, on such a fundamental issue, it's only very short time. And we, as Transparency International, working on anti-corruption, we have been founded in 1993, and we still have a long way to go. So I don't think and I don't hope that we have a very long time still for at least fundamental human rights issues within sport. But we are still on a journey, and I learned when working closely with FIFA in the advisory board that sometimes an organization like FIFA, who has started early compared to others, is a pioneer. And even if the guiding principles can well be adopted from business sector to the sports sector, that is quite often a mixture of business, yes, big business with FIFA and the IOC, but as well, it's a non-profit, it's working with volunteers a lot, working with a very difficult structure. So it can be adopted, but there are challenges. And so it's pioneers work, and again, one has to see how to work with specific issues, how to convince people to go this or to join us on this journey. What I observe is that we have the English-speaking countries far advanced to other areas of the world, and that maybe due to what Commonwealth Games Federation has been done. So I think that they started early, and they have, with the Commonwealth Games Federation and with the Commonwealth behind it, a very good institutional foundation to work on this, together. And so if I look to Germany and then even other areas in the world, there is a gap. And then we have the situation that some international federations or sport organizations have started, and the national federations and the national Olympic committees have still quite a long way to go, and how to bring it all together. Another aspect is that we have a time gap. The time of the awarding is not the time of the delivering of the event. So we are now living in a year everybody says, oh dear China, oh dear Qatar, what is sport doing? Well, they did 12 years ago or 7 years ago. That was the time of the awarding. And so we have the situation that the real first events, besides the Commonwealth Games, who have started earlier, but the real first events that have been awarded under the new ideas of human rights perspective will be 2024, the Paris Olympics, with a new host city contract of the IOC that the Sport and Rights Alliance has negotiated with the IOC in 2016, beginning of 2017, and the UEFA Euro 2024 in Germany. That has as well the bidding criteria of UEFA for this event have been negotiated by the Sport and Rights Alliance in autumn 2016 with UEFA. And I'm working, as I'm a German, on national level in the stakeholder initiative for the Euro 2024. And when I started to tell people in the host cities and others, well, we are working on human rights at the UEFA Euro 2024 in Germany, they looked at me and I saw they were thinking, what's that? We don't have torture in Germany. What is she talking about human rights? And then I have had to start to explain that anti-racism, safeguarding, gender diversity, that this is all human rights, because in the thinking and in the usage of language within sport, these are different topics, but human rights is somehow something else. So I'm coming from sport and now being involved in the NGO and human rights community for several years, I'm always translating, not English to German or to French, but I'm translating human rights language to sport language and vice versa. So that's one of the challenges we have, not to think there are only bad people in sport that don't care for human rights, but sometimes human rights people and sport people talking about the same content, but on in different languages on different levels. So that's part of the challenge. If it comes to implementation, just some aspects here. We need to have human rights as well as compliance, not in a silo within an organization, but on the high level of decision making. I think that's very important, not to have the sustainability officer dealing a little bit with environmental issues and now dealing as well a little bit with human rights issues and makes it stakeholder involvement. No, it's part of the executive committee on the highest level to deal with human rights issues, to be present at systematic stakeholder involvement and to hear what stakeholders are saying. And that's the second aspect. Stakeholders involvement on the national and international level is so important. That has already been touched. But what I want to add as a very important point from my perspective, it was, I think, from Daniela or in one of the questions, what will happen after the event is over? If you don't have, and if you don't support the stakeholders on the national level, then of course you cannot just jump into a country for several years of preparation and then for 2 or 4 weeks of an event, get out again and think the country has changed. The people in the country, at least a critical mass of people in the country, civil society in the country must support what's going to happen and must continue to work on change. And so with systematic stakeholder involvement on international and national levels, sport has the possibility to go into a country and support and strengthen civil society in the country. And that's the only thing we can do to really have a legacy on human rights and on other important issues. And I think that's why it's so important to stress this again and again. And we have a lot of reluctance within the sport community regarding stakeholder involvement, external stakeholders, because there's so much of self-reference. They are so important in their own country. On the international level, the United Nations is talking to Thomas Bach and others, and the Council of Europe with Infantino again and again. So why should they look onto civil society? That's what the next big step would be, to really have systematic, continuously stakeholder involvement from international sport organizations and from organizing committees on the national and international level. So FIFA has it as a part of its bidding criteria that national stakeholders have to be involved, but we need it in other organizations as well. And finally, regarding enforcement, if you look again onto the two big events this year, what will you enforce? Whatever clause you have had, I'm a lawyer, so I'm really very much interested in good contracts and have everything in the contract and wonderful clauses. But what in the end will you enforce against a country like China? There is a lot more to do on a country like Qatar, a small one, a country wanting to have a good reputation because they are so small and in such a area of tension in the region where they are situated. So it works with international pressure. But what kind of international pressure you want to do on a country like China? So that's part of the challenge. You can have pressure onto a National Olympic Committee, maybe even on an organizing committee. But finally, if it's about human rights, it's a country who has to respect, to protect human rights in its territory. And countries to enforce something from the outside as an international sport organization within a country, that's really a challenge. And I don't know any contract that can guarantee that, even if it's the best contract possible. So we just have to go ahead, work on change management within sport, and see what sophisticated solutions we can find to make small steps to enforcement. And again, I think the most important issue is to have strong civil society organizations within the country and internationally that can support change management. Thank you.
Sylvia, there's a lot to consider in terms of what some of the points you made there. That was outstanding. David, I know you've got a few points that you want to make as we start to move to the audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of three sort of positive points and one slightly more challenging one. So, I mean, we've heard some really detailed assessments of the situation we're in from those that are really close to this on the ground. But I think clearly, I think it's been undeniable that there's been significant progress made in terms of recognising, one, that these mega projects have the potential to exacerbate human rights infringements. So we kind of know that. There's been lots of detailed evidence and reports about that. And secondly, that there are also responsibilities that must be borne by both state bodies, event owners, but also other actors to address these. And obviously Liz was suggesting that then how we follow through, and that is a much more difficult challenge. And secondly, I think from a position not that long ago where it was quite difficult to find the words human rights in bidding, planning, delivery regulations and guidelines for these mega events, we now, I think, are in a position where we know that each event owner has a human rights policy. Most have quite detailed requirements, guidelines, different languages used. Many have independent human rights advisory groups, as Sylvia just talked about, or equivalent to those. We've seen risk assessment now built into the process for the United 2026 event, for example. So for me, there does seem to be a lot more, again, progress being seen there in terms of it being embedded and enshrined more effectively. And thirdly, I think impressed at the collaborations that we see between event owners, state bodies, NGOs, and others, and the like, to continually improve that position and minimize human rights infringements. For me, I think it's better to have those conversations between different parties coming together under the banner of whether it's a centre or under the Sport and Human Rights Alliance, rather than the individual actors working separately and on their own. We know that that's not easy. There'll be ongoing tensions, differences of opinion, discussions, but I think it's a mature way to move forward, to see that there's much more openness, transparency, because I think that provides the foundations of trust that can only help in this broader sphere around human rights and mega sporting events. And I guess just the last point is a slightly more negative one, which is about, although there's clearly quite a lot of progress being made, there are still those questions about how integrated that rights-based approach is, especially around about awarding events. So there's been obviously some concerns in recent years about awarding events to countries that have poor records, even although the policies look like that might not have been possible. And secondly, how human rights related issues are embedded in the governance structures of the awarding bodies, and how influential and important that is within the general organizational kind of context and environment. So that's all I would add at this point. But yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really fascinating discussion so far.
Thank you, David. Please, I encourage you to type any questions you may have in the chat. I'll just kick off with one that any of the panelists can answer in terms of what role do you see for advocacy and lobbying in strengthening the human rights governance of both major and mega sporting events? Any of you want to take that?
I can. Oh,
go ahead. Please.
Oh, thanks, Andreas. I just wanted to echo that it does work, because we've seen that the Sports and Rights Alliance has had that impact already. So we do know that this works. We've seen the impact that Human Rights Watch, using an event as a platform to talk about physical abuse in Japanese sport. You know, you can use these events as catalysts for broader discussions about rights in sport as well. So it is really important. I think the challenge comes down to the area that we're talking about, and that Sylvia expressed so eloquently around, you know, how do you hold the Chinese government to account? And I think that's a much more difficult question. But what you can do is raise public awareness. You can encourage boycotts. You can put pressure on sponsors. You can have campaigns. You can encourage articles in the media. There's lots of different channels that can be used to advocate for this change. And I think the coalitions that have come around this subject, particularly the Sports and Rights Alliance, have shown how you can do that really, really well and actually have an impact that leads to change for people, which is the whole reason to do any of this. So I thought I'd come in first, because Sylvia might feel a bit shy about talking about her own organisation's successes in this space.
I can maybe address the topic from the other side. Receiving a lot of, well, probably the criticism, but also sort of recognition in some examples for the work we do. From my perspective, three main things to highlight here. The first one is, and that's I think the main one, is to create a normative environment which defines what is the expected good behavior. And it's not, I appreciate the willingness and the need for some of the NGOs to try to find very direct cause-effect relationships between the work they do. But from my perspective, the most important work they do is very difficult to measure in these terms, which is really creating that environment where everyone involved in an organization of an event has to recognize that the stadium construction worker is simply not good enough anymore to say that this is out of our scope as a tournament organizer. So number one, create that normative environment, and that requires a lot of work. Secondly, is keep people like me and others honest, right? We are in the weeds of doing the work, and we see what we do, we publish what we do, we try to be as transparent as we can. But it's always also important for others to point the finger where it hurts, maybe to where the glass is still half empty, for us to keep that work going. And then lastly, I think it is about recognizing progress, and that goes a bit to the wider question that were discussed before. If progress is not recognized, then the champions who drive the change in those host countries, but also within sports federations, do not have the basis from which to take the next step. And that is one of the concerns I have a little bit now going into the last few months for Qatar, is there are so many people who have risked a lot in terms of personal, in Qatar, in terms of their personal credibility inside the country to use this event to drive change. And if that is not recognized, then that will have a negative impact, not only on what we can still achieve by the tournament, but also how long-lasting the legacy is in the end. And then maybe just a last thought on holding governments to account. I often get, we often get the comment, well, just threaten to take the tournament away, and then they'll probably do what you want them to do, or essentially take it away from the hosts. But I share Sylvia's view that is more a political question than a strictly legal question on how best to use leverage over a host country. Certainly my experience is that collaborative use of leverage with host country is much more efficient and effective than anything else. There is a scope question. My experience is that whenever there is an issue that is within the scope of the tournament, we tend to have a lot of success in using a leverage. As soon as something is outside of the scope of what the UNGPs would define, it gets much more difficult. And then there's a timing question, of course, with different degrees of leverage in different phases in the process. And certainly when the tournament is over, the leverage vanishes quite quickly. So yeah, a few considerations on that particular question.
Sylvia, we've got one question from the audience. I think we've just got time for one quick question that I want to pose from one of Liz's colleagues, Zara. How can we persuade mega sporting events to give more consideration to see the value in the legacy of their events? You know, thinking about examples from the Commonwealth Games Foundation in the Gold Coast in Australia. Have you got any thoughts from that, Sylvia?
No, not really, because legacy in some countries is always mixed with sustainability. So I have the problem in Germany, and then it's mostly on the infrastructure, and now for some years on the environment. And we first have to tell them that there must be a legacy as well regarding social situations, decent work in a country like Germany, or other human rights achievements. So again, it's very difficult in countries that are not already very much used to the UNGP and this approach to explain what it is all about, and to take the fear that it is just much more work, much more complicated, and I echo what Andreas said, that they will criticize anyway. And my impression why the IOC didn't publish its human rights strategy earlier, it is before the Olympics in Beijing, was because they were afraid of, when they have a commitment already made, that they would be even more attackable by the outside world because they don't stick to it. So I think, and that's especially the problem with Qatar, if we don't make clear to the broad public overall in the world that Qatar is not a perfect, but up to now the best example of how the UN Guiding Principles can work in such a difficult and challenging environment, then I think we will lose a big opportunity to demonstrate that the UN Guiding Principles can have a positive effect. And that's something I'm fighting for, especially in Germany, where we have a lot of criticism regarding Qatar. And even sometimes within the Sport and Rights Alliance, not coming specifically from a human rights organization, I'm a little bit more in the middle. And someone from IOC once called me the in-between person. So I try to not just to translate the different languages, but as well look onto the approach. And so it's really true what Andreas said. We have to acknowledge when there is progress, even if it's not enough, even if it's not perfect. It never will be perfect, at least not the next 5-10 years, whatever we do in whatever country. But we need to see there is progress. The UN Guiding Principles are working, and we have to continue to work on it with trial and error sometimes, but that's the only way we have. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. There's some wonderful questions that have been posed here, but unfortunately, because of time, what we'll do, as David mentioned earlier, that we're going to capture some of these questions and try to get some responses from some of these questions later. So I want to firstly thank the panelists. As you can see, they're incredibly busy individuals that have given up their time to spend with us today, and thank you all for your engagement. And I'll throw out a clap to all of you. And David, I'll turn it back to you.